What is the best type of dagger or small sidearm for defending yourself against swords? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and hopefully you saw my recent video with my friend Stephen at training where I went dagger against rapier. Now obviously this is a fairly unfair kind of match. It's quite difficult. You've got to be very offensive and aggressive, and you've got to close distance quickly with the dagger. But some interesting comments came out of that video. If you haven't seen it already, I'll stick it down in the link below here in the description. But fundamentally, some questions came up about what is the optimum type of knife or dagger to fight against a sword, a rapier. So one of the things I mentioned is, I believe a rapier is actually easier, despite the fact that the rapier is superb as a sword in dueling and one-on-one fighting. A rapier is easier to face with something like a dagger, or even unarmed, than necessarily a cut and thrust, or should we say a sword with more cutting capacity or more quick at cutting, something like a sabre or a backsword or a messer or an arming sword or something like this. And one of the reasons is that thrusts are easier to deal with your bare hands than, put the dagger down, which I'll show you in a second, easier to deal with your bare hands because they move in a straight line. So while everyone knows that thrusts are very effective and very direct and can be very quick, because they move in a straight line towards you, when a person's extended their arm out, they can redirect the point, but usually with their arm extended out, that is a weak point because they haven't got any more extension, assuming that they've lunged forwards and reached with their body as well. So at full extension, they've now got to retract back in order to bring the point in again. Yes, they could just bring the arm back and be doing this with their arm, and people often do this in fencing, but even that requires some movement back in a straight line with the arm in order to deliver the point. And also remember that thrusts have to be delivered like this. If they're delivered kind of skew-if, as I'd call it, at an angle, they're not necessarily going to penetrate your clothing, or at least not very much, so they won't put you out of combat. Against a knife attacker who's charging in, that's very, very dangerous place to be for the swordsman. So in many ways, because thrusts move in a straight line, it is easier to intersect them and close in quickly than it is with a cut, because a cut can keep going round and double up and keep in motion and keep coming from different directions. If I just grab any old, here we go, let's grab a sabre. If I come in to cut here, I can immediately come up with other cuts from different angles that pretty much, I won't say impossible, but very, very difficult to defend with the dagger against. Moreover, the dagger person, bearing in mind that they're closing in at high speed, even if they catch the first or the second, you can keep cutting to different locations, even at quite close range. Whereas thrusts you really can't, because thrusts have to be delivered with the tip. Now admittedly, you can break distance by running backwards, you can grab, you can grapple, you can push, you can even kick the person away in order to get the point in. And of course, you can bring the point back, and this is done very often in treatises, in techniques in the HEMA sources. But overall, just as a general statement, with some caveats and with some exceptions, someone who's thrusting at you is easier to deal with a short weapon than someone who's repeatedly cutting. Okay, right. So that point dealt with, what's the best type of dagger for defending against a sword in general, but a rapier, but potentially also something like a side sword or a sabre? Fundamentally, you want something with a long blade. Now, clearly, if it's long enough, it's going to become a sword, and then it's sword versus sword. But within reason, you want something with a large enough blade that you can wear it conveniently. So obviously, a longer blade is easier to deal with the sword than a shorter blade. Why? Because it gives you a greater surface area in order to encounter the opponent's blade, whether they're thrusting or cutting. You can cover more of your body and more distance, and you don't have to move your hands so far to get to the bind, that is the blade contact between your weapon and their weapon. So, blade length, super important. Second thing I would say is you want a blade which has some amount of mass to it. Okay, so you don't want something that's so heavy that it's slow, because speed is very, very important. And speed, honestly, is one of the only advantages you've got when you're fighting with only a knife. You've lost reach, you've lost all of these other things, especially reach. But if you've got some mass to your weapon, that enables you at least to oppose, especially cuts, but heavier blades, and bind with them on roughly equal terms. For reference, this is an early prototype of one of the upcoming Batch 2 Royal Armouries windlass Matt Easton replicas. And the original of this is quite weighty. It's as heavy as some sabres, and it's heavier than a small sword. So despite the fact it might look small, it has a fair amount of mass to it, and a lot of that mass is in the guard. And that's the second thing that you really want if you can get it. Now, guards come in many different forms, but for facing off against a sword, the first thing you really want are quillons. Now, quillons can either be long or straight, they can be curved, or they can be kind of double curved because they're curving upwards and forwards, kind of like hooks, a bit like coat hooks. And that is for a similar reason to coat hooks, you want to catch and control. So with this type of weapon, because it's designed as an offhand weapon to be used with the sword in the other hand, not only do you have a blade to oppose the incoming sword blade, but you've also got hooked quillons to stop it running away. Okay, not necessarily just to trap. I think a lot of people get fixated on trying to lock and trap the blade. Primarily, that's a second thing. I think primarily this is just here to provide greater hand protection. Okay, so having that, even if you miss the blade, it comes down, catches on the guard, it will still do the same job. So essentially this is a bit like a trident or a corset at this point. So you've got a blade, you've got cross guards which can hook and control, and massive advantage to have any form of additional side guard. Now this has got a large ring that is filled with a decorative, well, and protective element in the middle there. And if you're fighting, clearly that will help protect points going in there, which is very advantageous if you're using it against a sword or dagger of any kind. And there are, of course, some sometimes referred to as sail guard daggers, which come all the way around here, which provide even more protection. There are pluses and minuses. Overall, they provide more protection, but I do find that this kind of ring is actually better for catching and controlling. So again, pluses and minuses, your mileage might vary, but generally speaking, as much hand protection as you can get. Now, on that topic, some people mentioned the alehouse dagger, as they've sometimes been termed, and that is essentially a basket-hilted, I mean, if I just grab a basket-hilted sword here, that is like a basket hilt on a dagger blade. Now, absolutely, that is going to be very formidable in defending you against swords and closing in. It is basically akin to wearing a gauntlet. I'll come back to gauntlets in a second. So it's essentially a fully armoured fist attached to a dagger. However, most people for practical purposes wouldn't have and didn't historically wear those because they would be very cumbersome, very big. They probably socially would be a bit weird thing to walk around with. So it'd be a bit like walking around town with a 50 cal Barrett slung on your shoulder. It's just a weird thing. If you're going to wear a dagger, that's kind of socially acceptable. If you're going to wear a dagger with a massive basket hilt, that's a little bit weird. Yes, it is advantageous against sword. However, let's think about this in context. And if you're just defending yourself with a dagger against a sword, it suggests that you're unprepared. So generally speaking, if you want to wear and carry a relatively typical dagger that is good for protecting you against swords or other larger weapons, this kind of thing is it. Something with big quillons, preferably hooked quillons, preferably a side guard, preferably a relatively long blade, preferably a fairly beefy blade. Right, final thing. Some people did ask me, would it be easier if you had a gauntlet with your dagger? Well, maybe we'll test this, but my supposition is that yes, absolutely, of course it would be, because my hand would be invulnerable to thrusts now. This is hardened carbon steel. There is no rapier in the world which is going to thrust through this. So it would literally mean that it would be like having a buckler. Again, it would be like having a basket hilt or a buckler joined to a dagger. So yes, absolutely. The only disadvantage, I would say, is this does make your hand heavier. This weighs about the same as this, so you've probably doubled the amount of weight in your hand. And remember that when you've got a short weapon, any good swordsman is going to be going high and low and coming in from different angles, and it's now slowing down the speed at which I can move my hand and my dagger together because I've doubled the weight that I'm holding. Oh, and the final thing, while I think of it, is maybe we'll look at just gauntlet versus sword, because actually just this by itself is pretty effective against swords. And it is something that sometimes was used in the offhand together with rapiers and side swords. So maybe let's test that as well. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you back on the channel really soon. I have been Matt Easton. I will continue to be. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.